I lost my home in less than 10 minutes, but what broke me wasn't the fire. It was standing on my own son's doorstep, covered in smoke and ash, begging for help and hearing the door close in my face. In that moment, I realized something far worse than losing everything. I realized I had already lost him. And just when I thought I had nothing left, someone I once saved came back for me in a way I never expected. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Evelyn Carter, and for 40 years, I woke up to the sound of waves brushing against the shore just beyond my back porch in Monterey, California. That house was never grand, never the kind people slowed down to admire, but to me, it was everything a life could hold. It was where my husband, Thomas Carter, laughed over burnt toast on Sunday mornings, where my son, Daniel Carter, took his first steps across the creaky wooden floor, and where I learned that love often meant giving more than you ever planned to. The house itself had aged with me. The paint had faded under decades of salty air, the wooden beams sighed on colder nights, and the wiring, though functional, had long since passed its prime. I knew all of this. I simply chose not to think about it too much. Repairs cost money, and money had always been something I learned to stretch rather than spend. After Thomas passed away, the house grew quieter. Silence settled into the corners like dust, thick and unmoving. I filled my days with small rituals. Each morning I brewed tea and sat by the window facing the ocean, watching the horizon shift from gray to gold. Sometimes I would catch myself listening for footsteps that no longer came. Daniel used to call more often. When he was younger, his voice carried warmth, urgency, a need to tell me everything. Over time, that changed. His calls became shorter, more structured, squeezed between meetings and obligations. He had built a successful life as a corporate lawyer in San Jose, living in a gated community with polished streets and larger homes than mine could ever be. I was proud of him. I had worked night shifts, sold the small piece of land my parents left me, and given up every safety net just to make sure he graduated without debt. I told myself that was enough. His wife, Melissa Carter, came from a different world. She was elegant, composed, and always seemed to know exactly how things should be done. She was never openly rude, but there was a distance in her voice, a careful politeness that never softened into warmth. I often felt like a guest in her presence, even when she stood in my doorway. Then there was Lily Brooks. She had come into my life years ago as a thin, frightened 12-year-old with nowhere to go. I gave her a place at my table, a blanket on my couch, and what little stability I could offer. Now she was a successful businesswoman in Silicon Valley, running a company I could barely begin to understand. Yet she still called me Mom. She still asked how I was, and she still remembered the little things, like how I took my tea. As the years passed, the house felt larger, emptier. I told myself it was part of growing older, that solitude was simply another stage of life. Still, there were moments when the quiet pressed too hard against my chest. A few days before everything changed, I noticed the lights flicker once or twice in the hallway. There was also a faint smell, something sharp and unfamiliar, like overheated wires. I paused, considered calling someone, then dismissed it. It was probably nothing, just another sign of an old house settling into itself. That night, as I turned off the lamp and listened to the ocean in the distance, I remember thinking how fragile everything suddenly felt, though I could not yet understand why. If you're still here and feeling the quiet tension building, comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's see what happens when everything begins to fall apart. I woke to a smell that did not belong in my home. It was sharp and bitter, like melting plastic, cutting through the quiet of the night. For a moment, I lay still, trying to place it, convincing myself it was nothing more than an old appliance acting up. The house had its quirks, and I had grown used to ignoring them. But then I noticed the air. It felt heavier, thicker, as if it resisted each breath I took. I sat up slowly, my heart beginning to beat faster, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor felt warm beneath my feet. That was when I knew something was wrong. When I opened my bedroom door, a wave of gray smoke rolled in, stinging my eyes instantly. I coughed, instinctively covering my mouth, but the burning in my throat only worsened. The hallway beyond was already alive with flickering orange light. Flames crawled along the walls and ceiling as if they had been waiting for me to notice them. There was no time to think, only time to move. I turned back into my room, my hands trembling as I looked around. 40 years of life surrounded me, and yet none of it could be saved. My eyes landed on a small wooden box on the dresser. Inside were photographs, Thomas smiling in the sunlight, Daniel as a boy holding a school trophy, moments that could never be replaced. I grabbed it without hesitation and pressed it against my chest. The heat grew stronger as I stepped back into the hallway. The smoke thickened, making it harder to see, harder to breathe. I moved forward blindly, one hand against the wall, guiding myself toward the front door. Beneath my feet, the floor burned hotter with each step, and I could feel the soles of my slippers beginning to soften. As I passed the living room, I caught a glimpse of the piano, its polished surface now reflecting the fire that consumed it. I remember teaching Daniel his first notes there, his small fingers pressing uncertainly against the keys. The memory vanished as a beam cracked loudly above me, sending sparks cascading down. I stumbled forward, my lungs screaming for air, my vision narrowing. Every step felt heavier than the last. When I finally reached the front door, my hands fumbled with the lock before I managed to pull it open. Cool air rushed toward me, and I fell forward onto the porch, gasping, coughing, clutching the wooden box as if it were the only thing anchoring me to the world. Voices echoed around me. Neighbors had gathered, their silhouettes shifting in the glow of the flames. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I did not recognize who it was. I could only stare as the fire devoured everything I had ever known. Windows shattered one by one, each explosion sending shards of glass into the night. The roof began to collapse inward, sparks rising like embers of memory drifting away. The fire trucks arrived quickly, their sirens cutting through the chaos, but I could see it in their faces before they even spoke. It was already too late. They told me it was likely an electrical failure, something old, something worn beyond its limits. I nodded, though the words barely reached me. All I could think about was what was gone. No clothes, no documents, no home, nothing. The realization settled over me, not as a wave, but as a quiet, suffocating weight. I had nowhere to go. There was only one person I could call, Daniel. My hand shook as I dialed his number. It rang longer than I expected. When he answered, his voice was thick with sleep and irritation. I told him what had happened, each word breaking apart as it left my mouth. There was a pause, then a sigh, followed by a response that felt colder than the night air. He said I could come, but only for a day. Just a day. I held on to that fragile offer as if it were something solid. A neighbor pressed a few bills into my hand, guiding me toward a waiting taxi. I thanked her, though I barely heard my own voice. During the ride, I sat in silence, clutching the wooden box, watching the dark streets blur past. Everything behind me was gone. Everything ahead felt uncertain. When the taxi stopped, I found myself standing before Daniel's house. It was large, immaculate, untouched by anything resembling loss. I stood at the door, staring at the polished surface, my reflection faint and unfamiliar. Then I raised my hand to knock. If this moment hit you and you're starting to feel the weight of what's coming, comment number 2 below so I know you're still watching. Now, let's see how far this rejection really goes. I stood there for a long moment before I pressed the doorbell, my hand hovering in the air as if something inside me already knew what was waiting on the other side. The house in front of me was everything mine had never been. It rose in clean, sharp lines, glass and stone reflecting the pale morning light, untouched by loss, untouched by anything that resembled struggle. It felt foreign, like a place I had no right to enter. When I finally pressed the bell, the sound echoed softly inside. I waited. Nothing happened. I pressed it again, this time holding it a second longer, as if urgency might make a difference. The door opened just enough for Melissa to appear. She looked exactly as she always did, composed, polished, as though she had stepped out of a magazine rather than out of bed. Her eyes moved over me slowly, taking in the soot on my clothes, the smoke in my hair, the exhaustion I could not hide. Her expression did not change, but something in it tightened, almost imperceptibly. She did not step aside. I asked for Daniel, my voice thinner than I expected, barely steady enough to carry the weight of everything I had just lost. Melissa turned her head slightly and called his name, her tone calm, almost casual, as if announcing a visitor rather than a mother who had nowhere else to go. Daniel appeared behind her a moment later. For a brief second, we simply looked at each other. I searched his face for something familiar, something warm, something that would tell me I had not made a mistake coming here. What I found instead was hesitation, followed by something colder, something that felt like distance carefully maintained. I told him what had happened, though he already knew. The words felt heavy, unnecessary, but I needed him to hear them from me. I needed him to understand. He listened, but not the way a son listens to his mother. There was no urgency in him, no instinct to move closer, no shift in his posture that suggested concern. Instead, he glanced briefly past me, as if measuring the inconvenience of the situation against the rhythm of his day. Melissa remained beside him, her presence steady, her hand resting lightly on his arm, as though guiding him without saying a word. The conversation that followed felt less like a conversation and more like a decision being formed in real time. Words were exchanged, but they carried no comfort. They were careful, controlled, framed around timing, space, disruption, around what could not be done rather than what should have been. Then Daniel let out a small, dismissive breath, the kind someone makes when faced with something they would rather not deal with. He said there was no room. The sentence did not land all at once. It unfolded slowly inside me, each word settling deeper than the last. No room. I looked past him into the house. I saw open space, wide hallways, a staircase that curved upward into rooms I would never see. There was space everywhere, except for me. Melissa's hand tightened slightly on his arm. He did not move away from it. The door closed without force, without anger, just a quiet, deliberate motion. It ended not with a sound, but with an absence. I stood there long after it was shut, staring at the surface as if it might open again if I waited long enough. The morning light had grown brighter, warming the street, but I felt none of it. Somewhere nearby, a woman paused while sweeping her driveway. She glanced in my direction, then quickly looked away, as if witnessing something too uncomfortable to acknowledge. I stepped back slowly, my legs unsteady, and lowered myself onto the curb. The wooden box rested in my lap, my fingers curled tightly around its edges. I did not cry at first. The feeling inside me was too heavy for tears, too quiet for sound. I thought of Daniel as a child, of the nights I stayed awake beside him when he was sick, of the promises he once made without knowing how fragile they were. I wondered when those memories had stopped meaning anything to him. The realization came gently, but it settled like stone. I was alone. For a moment, I considered staying there, as if movement might make everything more real. Then another thought surfaced, hesitant at first, then clearer. Lily. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands trembling again, though for a different reason now. I hesitated before dialing, unsure if I had the right to ask anything of her. The line began to ring. I held the phone to my ear, listening, waiting, hoping she would answer. If you can feel the pain in that silence, and you're still with me, comment number 3 below. Now, let's find out who truly shows up when it matters most. The phone rang longer than I expected, each second stretching thin, fragile, as if it might snap before anyone answered. I almost pulled it away from my ear, already preparing myself for another silence, another reminder that I had nowhere left to turn. Then the line clicked. Lily's voice came through, steady but alert, the kind of voice that listens before it speaks. She did not ask many questions at first. She only noticed what I could not hide. My breathing was uneven, my words slow to form, my silence louder than anything I could say. When I finally managed to explain, it came out in pieces. The fire, the house, Daniel, the door. Each word felt heavier than the last, as though I were laying down the remains of my life one fragment at a time. I did not need to explain everything. Lily understood far more than I said. There was a shift in her tone, subtle but immediate. It carried something firm, something protective, something that left no space for doubt. She asked for my location, and when I told her, she gave me a simple instruction: stay where you are. I am coming. There were no conditions, no hesitation, no careful calculations, just certainty. When the call ended, I remained on the curb, the phone still in my hand. The street had begun to wake around me. Cars passed occasionally, their drivers unaware of the quiet collapse that had taken place just outside one of the largest houses on the block. The morning sun rose higher, casting light across perfectly trimmed lawns and polished driveways. Everything looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. I lowered my gaze to the wooden box resting in my lap. My fingers traced its edges absent-mindedly, grounding myself in something that still belonged to me. As I sat there, memories of Lily surfaced, uninvited but steady. I saw her as she had been years ago, standing hesitantly at my door, her clothes worn, her eyes guarded but hopeful. She had not asked for much then, just a place to sit, something to eat, a moment to breathe. I remembered the first time she called me Mom, her voice uncertain, as if the word might be taken away if she spoke it too loudly. I had never expected anything in return. The distant thrum of helicopter blades pulled me from my thoughts. At first, it blended with the morning sounds, easy to ignore, but it grew louder, closer, until it filled the air with a force that could not be overlooked. People began to notice. Doors opened. Heads turned. The helicopter descended into the street, sending wind and dust swirling around the quiet neighborhood. It did not belong there. It disrupted the stillness, drawing attention to something no one had wanted to see. When it landed, Lily stepped out. She moved quickly, her posture controlled, her expression focused. But when her eyes found me, something softened. She closed the distance between us without hesitation and wrapped her arms around me. In that moment, everything I had been holding back broke free. The tears came without resistance, quiet but unstoppable. I held on to her as if she were the only solid thing left in the world. She stayed with me, steady, present, not rushing, not pulling away. Then she guided me gently to my feet. Her hand remained firm around mine as she led me toward the helicopter. Before stepping in, I turned back once. Daniel's house stood exactly as it had before, untouched, distant, closed. Then I stepped inside, and the ground slowly fell away beneath us. If this twist surprised you and you're curious about what comes next, comment number 4 below to stay with me. Now, let's uncover the truth hidden beneath the surface. As the helicopter lifted into the sky, I felt the world I knew slip quietly beneath me. The neighborhood grew smaller, the streets narrowing into lines, the house that had once held my life now nothing more than an empty space I could not even see from that height. It should have felt like escape, but instead, it felt like something deeper was being left behind, something I had not yet fully understood. The air inside the cabin was warm and controlled, so different from the smoke that still clung to my lungs. Each breath came easier, yet my chest remained tight, as if the weight of everything that had happened refused to loosen its grip. My hands rested in my lap, still trembling slightly. The wooden box held close as if it were the only proof that my past had been real. Lily sat beside me, her presence steady and quiet. She did not fill the space with unnecessary words. Instead, she placed her hand gently over mine, grounding me without asking anything in return. It was a simple gesture, but it carried more comfort than anything I had felt in hours. When we landed, I found myself in a place that did not feel like it belonged to someone like me. The building rose high above the coastline, glass walls reflecting the endless stretch of the Pacific Ocean. Everything was polished, precise, untouched by time or hardship. People moved with purpose, their voices low, their steps measured. Lily guided me inside as if she had done this 1,000 times before. There was no hesitation in her movements, no uncertainty. The room she had prepared for me overlooked the ocean, the same ocean I had watched for decades, yet from here, it felt different, distant, removed. I stood in the center of the room for a long moment, unsure of what to do with myself. My life had been reduced to what I held in my hands, and even that felt fragile. Lily encouraged me to rest, to shower, to let the warmth wash away the smoke that lingered on my skin. I followed her instructions without resistance, too exhausted to question anything. Later, wrapped in clean clothes that did not belong to me, I sat by the window and stared at the horizon. The water moved the same way it always had, steady and indifferent. It reminded me that the world had not changed, even if mine had. Somewhere behind me, I could hear Lily speaking quietly on the phone. Her tone was different now, more focused, more deliberate. I did not catch every word, but I understood enough to know that she was already looking into what had happened. At first, I thought it was unnecessary. The fire had an explanation: old wiring, a house that had simply reached its limit. That was easier to accept, cleaner. But as the hours passed, small details began to surface. Lily mentioned that there had been recent work done on the electrical system, That caught my attention. I did not remember calling anyone. I did not remember scheduling repairs. The idea settled slowly, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Who had? I turned that question over in my mind, trying to find a simple answer, something that made sense, but nothing came. As the sun began to lower, casting long shadows across the water, Lily stepped back into the room. She held her phone in her hand, her expression calm but different, more serious than before. She looked at me for a moment, as if deciding how much to say. Then I realized something I had not allowed myself to consider. The fire might not have been an accident. I did not sleep that night. The thought circled in my mind with quiet persistence, refusing to fade no matter how many times I tried to push it away. Fire had always been something simple in my understanding. An accident, a failure, a tragic but natural consequence of something wearing out. It was easier to believe that, easier to accept that my home had simply reached the end of its life, just as I was reaching the later years of mine. But now that explanation felt incomplete. I sat by the window long after the lights of the building had dimmed, watching the ocean stretch into darkness. The waves moved with the same rhythm I had known for decades, yet I no longer found comfort in them. Instead, I felt a growing distance between the life I had lived and the one I was beginning to see. Lily did not rush me. She gave me space, allowing the silence to settle until I was ready to face it. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, grounded in something stronger than emotion. She told me only what she knew for certain. The electrical system in my house had not simply failed. It had been altered. Someone had accessed it recently, making changes that should not have been there. There had been a service request filed under my address, one I had never made. The company that handled it was legitimate, but the authorization trail led somewhere unexpected. It led indirectly toward a firm connected to Daniel. I felt something inside me pull tight, as if a thread I had spent years weaving was suddenly unraveling. My first instinct was to reject it completely. There had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding, something misfiled or misinterpreted. I held on to those possibilities with quiet desperation. I told myself that Daniel would never do something like that. He was my son. I had raised him. I knew him. Did I? The question came uninvited, sharp and unwelcome. Memories began to surface, small moments I had not paid attention to at the time. Conversations about property value, questions about insurance coverage, casual remarks that now carried a different weight. At the time, they had seemed practical, even responsible. Now they felt like pieces of something I had not wanted to see. I pressed my hands together, trying to steady the tremor building inside me. I did not want to follow that line of thought any further. If I did, I would have to face a possibility I was not ready to accept. Lily did not accuse him. She did not push me toward a conclusion. She only reminded me that the truth did not change depending on whether I chose to look at it. That was what made it harder. She told me we could confront him directly, but that it would likely lead to denial, excuses, and nothing more. Instead, she suggested something different. A situation where there would be no room to hide, where actions would speak for themselves. A public setting, a professional invitation, a place where Daniel would step forward willingly, unaware of what would be revealed. At first, the idea unsettled me. I did not want to humiliate my own son. I did not want revenge. That was not who I was. But Lily reminded me that this was not about revenge. It was about dignity, about allowing the truth to exist in the open, without distortion. I turned back toward the window, watching the first light of morning begin to break across the horizon. The ocean no longer felt like a place of comfort. It felt like something vast and indifferent, something that did not care whether I chose to look or look away. For the first time, I understood that avoiding the truth would not protect me. It would only keep me trapped inside something I no longer recognized. I closed my eyes briefly, then opened them again. I needed to see who my son had become. If you're still here and starting to see where this is heading, comment number 6 below to let me know. Now, let's move into chapter 7, where everything begins to unravel. The night of the gala arrived with a stillness I could not quite explain. Everything around me moved with precision, rehearsed and polished, yet inside, I felt something entirely different. Not fear, not exactly. It was closer to certainty, the kind that settles in when there is nothing left to avoid. Lily had arranged everything. The venue overlooked the city, glass walls rising from floor to ceiling, reflecting soft golden light across marble floors and carefully arranged tables. People moved in quiet confidence, dressed in tailored suits and evening gowns, their conversations measured, their laughter controlled. It was a world I had never belonged to, yet that night I stood among them. Lily had insisted I prepare. My hair had been styled, my dress chosen with care, every detail considered. When I looked at myself earlier that evening, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror. She looked composed, dignified, almost untouched by loss. But beneath that surface, I carried everything that had brought me there. When we entered, the room shifted subtly. Not dramatically, but enough to be felt. People noticed Lily, of course. They always did. But that night, they noticed me too. I could feel their eyes, their curiosity, their quiet attempts to place me within a world where I had no clear role. Then Daniel arrived. He walked in with the same confidence I had seen so many times before, his posture straight, his expression controlled. Melissa was beside him, elegant as ever, her presence seamless, almost effortless. For a brief moment, his eyes met mine. Something flickered there, something uncertain, but it passed quickly, replaced by the same composure he wore like a shield. Dinner began with polite conversation, the kind that filled space without revealing anything real. I remained mostly silent, observing, listening, allowing the evening to unfold as it was meant to. Lily guided the conversation carefully. She did not rush. She did not force anything. Instead, she shifted the focus gradually, drawing attention toward the idea of influence, of the people who shape our lives in ways that cannot be measured by success or wealth. Then she spoke about me. She introduced me as her mother. The words settled over the room, quiet but undeniable. I felt it more than I heard it. A few guests exchanged glances, surprised but respectful. Across the table, I saw Melissa's posture stiffen slightly. She attempted to correct the moment, not openly, but enough to suggest a difference between truth and perception. Lily did not allow it. She spoke calmly, clearly, defining motherhood not by blood, but by presence, by sacrifice, by the choices that shape a life. Her words did not rise in volume, yet they carried through the room with undeniable weight. The shift was immediate. Daniel sat still, his composure tightening. He tried to remain detached, professional, but I could see it now. The cracks were there, small but visible. Then Lily moved further. She introduced details, carefully, deliberately. The electrical work, the authorization, the connections that should not have existed. Each piece was placed with precision, forming a pattern that could not be ignored. The room grew quiet. Daniel responded, but his words lacked the certainty they once held. Melissa's calm began to fracture, her control slipping just enough to be noticed. I sat there, listening, feeling the truth settle into place around me. When I finally spoke, my voice did not tremble. It did not need to. I did not say much. I did not need to explain anything. Everything that mattered had already been revealed. Daniel looked at me then, truly looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. But it was too late. The room had already decided, and so had I. The night after the gala did not bring the relief I had expected. Instead, it left behind a quiet heaviness that settled deep within me. The truth had been spoken, laid out in front of strangers, acknowledged without denial. Yet the clarity it brought was not comforting. It was final. Back at Lily's place, everything felt still. The ocean stretched beyond the glass, calm and endless, as if nothing had changed. But inside me, something had shifted permanently. I was no longer searching for answers. I had them. What remained was deciding what to do with them. Lily gave me space. She understood that some realizations could not be rushed, that certain truths needed to settle before they could be faced. I spent most of that night sitting quietly, replaying moments in my mind, not with confusion anymore, but with a painful sense of understanding. The next afternoon, my phone rang. Melissa. For a long moment, I stared at her name on the screen. The instinct to ignore it came quickly, almost naturally, but something held me there. Curiosity, perhaps, or the quiet certainty that there was still more I had not heard. I answered. Her voice was different. The careful control she always carried was gone, replaced by something unsteady, something closer to fear. She asked if we could meet, just the two of us. No explanations, no conditions, just a request. I agreed. We met in a quiet cafe near the coastline, far from the noise of the city and the eyes that had watched everything unfold the night before. When Melissa walked in, I barely recognized her. She looked smaller somehow, her composure fractured, her movements less certain. She sat across from me and did not speak right away. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unsure of herself. When she finally began, the words came slowly. She admitted that she had influenced Daniel, not with force, but with suggestion, with doubt, with carefully placed fears. She had been afraid of losing control, afraid that I would always come before her, afraid that their life would never fully belong to them if I remained close. I listened without interruption. Then she spoke about money. There had been investments that failed, risks that did not pay off, debts that grew quietly in the background. She had hidden them, managed them as long as she could, until control became necessity. Daniel's finances became the solution, and I became the obstacle. But what she said next settled deeper than anything else. Daniel had known. He had known about my situation long before the fire. He had known that I was struggling, that I had fewer options than I admitted, and he had chosen to do nothing. Not out of confusion, not out of manipulation, but out of decision. I felt something inside me go still. Melissa continued, her voice breaking as she spoke about conversations she had overheard, about plans Daniel had begun to consider, legal strategies, ways to manage assets that were not yet his, discussions about control, about influence, about what could be done if circumstances changed. She said she was afraid of what he was becoming. Then she looked at me, her expression pleading in a way I had never seen before, and asked me to help him. I understood then what she was asking. She wanted me to carry him again. I shook my head slowly. There was no anger in me, no desire to argue or accuse, only clarity. I had spent a lifetime giving, believing that love meant endurance. But this was something else. This was a pattern I could no longer sustain. I stood, leaving my untouched cup on the table, and walked away without another word. When I returned to Lily, I told her everything. She listened carefully, her expression unreadable, her mind already moving ahead. When I finished, She nodded once, as if something had been confirmed. This time there would be no public stage, only the truth, and nowhere left to hide. And this time, I would not be the one left outside the door. If you've made it this far and you're ready for the final truth, comment number 8 below. Now let's move into the ending and see how this story truly resolves. By the time Daniel arrived, I had already made my decision. Lily's home was quiet that evening, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty, but intentional. The table was set simply, without the polished excess of the gala, without an audience to observe or judge. This was not about appearances. This was about truth. When the door opened, Daniel stepped inside alone. He looked different. Not physically, not in any way that could be easily described, but there was something in his posture that had shifted. The confidence he once carried so naturally now seemed restrained, as if he were unsure where to place it. We sat across from each other. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt filled with everything that had already been said, everything that could not be taken back. When he finally began, his voice was softer than I remembered. He spoke of regret, of mistakes, of pressure. He spoke of confusion, of influence, of how things had gone too far before he understood what he was doing. The words came carefully, as though chosen to repair something already broken. Listened. Not to what he said, but to what remained beneath it. It did not take long. He spoke of moving forward, of rebuilding, of finding a way to bring things back to what they had been. Then, almost without noticing, he shifted. His words began to circle around practical things, living arrangements, stability, what would happen next, how things could be managed. That was when I understood. Nothing had changed. Lily placed a folder on the table, her movement calm, almost quiet. Inside were the things he had hoped would remain hidden: legal inquiries, plans, questions about control, about what could be done, not for me, but with me. Daniel's expression faltered. He tried to explain, but there was nothing left to explain. I stood slowly, feeling the weight of the years behind me, but also something new, something steadier than I had ever known. When I spoke, my voice did not rise. It did not need to. I told him about the life I had given him, not as a reminder, but as a truth that existed whether he acknowledged it or not. I told him about the nights I worked, the things I gave up, the belief I held that love would be returned in its own way. Then I told him I forgave him, not because he deserved it, but because I no longer wanted to carry the pain he had given me. But forgiveness was not the same as trust. I told him he would not have access to my life, my decisions, or anything that came from them, that I would no longer stand in a place where I could be used, managed, or set aside. For the first time, he looked at me without certainty. When he left, he did not argue. The door closed behind him, soft and final. And this time, I knew it was I who had closed it. 6 months after the fire, I stood in a home that was both new and deeply familiar. It sat along the Monterey coast, not far from where my old house once stood, but everything about it felt different. The walls were stronger, the wiring modern, the windows wide enough to let the ocean in without letting the past weigh too heavily on the present. Each morning, I returned to a routine I thought I had lost. I made tea, carried it to the window, and watched the horizon shift with the light. The ocean had not changed, but I had. There was a quiet steadiness in me now, something that no longer depended on who stayed or who left. Lily visited often. She moved through the house with an ease that made it feel complete, as though she had always belonged there. Over time, the word daughter no longer felt like something symbolic. It became real in a way that required no explanation. When she spoke about her future, about building a life of her own, I listened not with worry, but with pride. We made things official as well. Papers were signed, names were written, but the truth had already existed long before that. She was my family, not by chance, but by choice. I heard little about Daniel. What I knew came indirectly, fragments carried by distance. His life had shifted, though I no longer followed the details. That chapter had closed, not with anger, but with acceptance. Sometimes, in the quiet of the afternoon, I thought about everything that had burned away. The house, the years, the version of love I once believed in. Loss had stripped everything down to its core, leaving only what was true. I understood now that love without respect cannot survive, that giving without limit does not guarantee it will be returned, and that dignity, once reclaimed, must be protected. One evening, as the sun lowered into the ocean, there was a knock at the door. I stood still for a moment, listening. Then I walked toward it, not with fear, not with expectation, but with choice. Because this time, whatever waited on the other side, I would decide whether the door would open. In the end, life has a quiet way of revealing what truly matters. Not everything that breaks is meant to be rebuilt the same way, and not every bond is meant to last simply because it once existed. Sometimes, loss is not an ending, but a necessary clearing, a fire that burns away illusion so that something more honest can take their place. True connection is never defined by obligation, but by presence, respect, and the willingness to stand beside someone when it matters most. There comes a moment when choosing peace is greater than holding on, and when protecting one's dignity becomes the most important act of love. If this story resonated with you, thank you for staying until the end. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments, and do not forget to follow and subscribe for more stories that remind us we are not alone.